My name is Carol Thompson, I'm 59 years old, and my own son tried to have me declared mentally incompetent to steal his father's $55 million inheritance. Before I tell you how his plan backfired so spectacularly that it utterly destroyed him, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The air in the lawyer's conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I sat on one side of the vast, polished mahogany table, and on the other sat my only son, Kevin, and his wife, Tiffany. Tiffany, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer dress, shot me a look of practiced pity, the kind you give a confused old woman. She thought I was about to be gently put out to pasture. Kevin was worse. He wasn't even trying to hide the smug little smirk playing on his lips. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. They thought this was their coronation day. They thought they knew exactly what was about to happen. I just sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and I let them think it. Our family lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man who had known my husband Frank for 40 years, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the silent room. He adjusted his glasses, picked up the thick, leather-bound document and began to read. This is the last will and testament of Franklin Wallace Thompson. He went through the usual legal preamble, revoking all previous wills, declaring Frank of sound mind and body. Kevin's legs started bouncing under the table, his impatience palpable. Tiffany reached over and placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. A silent calm down, it's almost ours gesture. Then Mr. Davies arrived at the crucial part. He paused, looked over his glasses first at me, then at them, and read the first sentence of the disposition of assets. All of my estate, including but not limited to, all business interests in Thompson Construction, all real property, and all liquid assets, I give to my beloved wife, Carol Thompson. The smirk on Kevin's face didn't just fade. It was wiped clean, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. His bouncing legs stopped dead. Tiffany's face, which had been a healthy, excited pink, drained of all color, turning a pasty, sickly white. The condescending pity in her eyes evaporated, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. The silence that fell over the room wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight, pressing down on all of us. This was the moment their world, the one they had built on a foundation of greed and entitlement, began to crack. To understand how we got here, to understand the look of pure, unadulterated hatred my son was now giving me across that polished table, we have to go back to the beginning. To the day of his father's funeral, just 1 week before. Frank's funeral was exactly what he would have wanted, dignified, filled with people who genuinely respected him, and a celebration of a life well lived. I chose to wear a deep crimson dress. Not for attention, not for scandal, but because it was the color Frank always said made my eyes sparkle. It was my private tribute to him, a final vibrant statement of our love. It was also a silent message to Kevin and Tiffany that I was not a woman defeated by grief. I was still very much alive. I could feel their judgmental stares on my back the entire service. Later that day, back at our home in Austin, the house was filled with mourners sharing stories about Frank. I played the part of the grieving widow, accepting condolences, my smile perfectly pleasant while my heart felt like a block of ice. I needed a moment to myself, so I slipped away toward the kitchen to check on the catering. That's when I heard their voices from the hallway, low and conspiratorial. They thought they were alone. Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million estate, Kevin said, his voice dripping with a satisfaction that made my stomach turn. I froze, my hand hovering over a tray of glasses. Then came Tiffany's reply, a silky, poisonous whisper. That's right, honey. We're in charge now. The crystal wine glass in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just greed talking. This was a coup. They weren't just planning to take the money. They were planning to take my life, my home, my future, everything Frank and I had built together for 40 years. It was a declaration of war. I carefully placed the crystal glass on the marble countertop, my hand perfectly steady. And in that moment, looking at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, I made a promise to my late husband, to myself, and to them. A promise of what was to come. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my crimson dress, and I walked back into that room full of mourners with my head held high, the crimson fabric of my dress a silent armor. For 40 years I had been the perfect wife to a powerful man, the gracious hostess, the supportive partner. I knew how to navigate these rooms, how to accept a condolence with a sad smile, while my mind was racing a million miles an hour. But something inside me had shifted. The grief was still there, a hollow ache in my chest, but now it was joined by a cold, hard anger. My son, Kevin, the boy I had rocked to sleep and whose scraped knees I had bandaged, had become a stranger. The transformation had been slow, insidious, beginning the day he brought Tiffany home 5 years ago. She was beautiful, I couldn't deny that. Polished and sharp, with eyes that assessed the value of everything they landed on. Frank had seen it right away. "She's got a calculator for a heart, Carol," he'd murmured to me one night after a tense family dinner. I had defended her, defended Kevin's choice. "He loves her, Frank," I'd insisted. "That's what matters." How wrong I had been. Love had nothing to do with it. This was an acquisition. I moved through the crowd, my thoughts a whirlwind, but my expression was serene. I saw them near the back by the grand fireplace, Kevin and Tiffany. They were a portrait of feigned grief. Kevin, who had inherited his father's height but none of his integrity, kept loosening his tie as if the pretense of sorrow was choking him. Tiffany would occasionally dab at her dry eyes with a tissue, all while subtly checking her phone. They thought no one was watching, but I was. I saw every whispered exchange, every shared smirk. The reception wore on. People ate, drank, and shared fond memories of my husband. I played my part to perfection. It was what Frank would have expected, and more importantly, it was what I needed them to see. I was in control. I was the grieving but strong matriarch. I slipped into the kitchen to speak with the caterers, needing a moment away from the sympathetic eyes and the endless condolences. The house was quiet in this wing, the sounds of the reception muffled. And that's when I heard it. Their voices carrying clearly down the empty hallway from the study. They must have thought it was a private space to continue their plotting. Kevin's voice came first, low and thick with a smugness that made my skin crawl. "Don't expect a dime from Dad's $55 million estate," he said. It wasn't a warning. It was a gloat, a pronouncement. I froze, my hand on the cool marble countertop. I could feel the blood drain from my face. It wasn't the mention of the money that hurt. Frank and I had built our life from nothing. I knew the value of every single dollar. It was the absolute lack of love, of grief, of respect in his tone. His father wasn't even cold in the ground, and this was what filled his mind. Then came Tiffany's voice, a silky, venomous purr that wrapped around his words. "That's right, honey. We're in charge now." The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. We're in charge now. As if I was just a piece of furniture to be moved or discarded. An obstacle. For 5 years, I had watched her poison my son's mind, turning him against me with subtle manipulations and not-so-subtle greed. I had tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just a jealous mother. But hearing it laid bare, so stark and cruel, in the quiet of my own home on the day of my husband's funeral, it changed everything. The grief in my chest didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It turned from a soft, aching sorrow into something sharp, cold, and diamond-hard. That was the moment the grieving widow died and someone else was born. The woman who would see this through to the end. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked back into the reception. My smile never faltered. But inside, the game had begun. And I intended to win. The days after the funeral were a blur of logistics and condolences, but beneath the surface of my grief, a new purpose was taking root. I thought constantly about Kevin. How had the sweet boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard become this cold, calculating man? The answer always came back to Tiffany. She saw our family not as a unit of love, but as a corporation whose assets she was determined to acquire. On the third morning after the funeral, while sorting through some of Frank's things in his home office, my hand brushed against a small locked box in his nightstand drawer. I knew the combination. It was our anniversary date. Inside, nestled among some old photographs and his military service medals, was a thick, sealed envelope with my name, Carol, written in his familiar, strong handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter began with words of love that made fresh tears spring to my eyes, but then the tone shifted. "My dearest Carol," he wrote. "If you're reading this, then my time has come. But I couldn't leave without making sure you were protected. I've been watching Kevin for the past 2 years, and I don't like the man he's becoming. That woman has filled his head with poison and entitlement. He sees our life's work not as a legacy to be honored, but as a prize to be claimed. He has forgotten the meaning of earning his way. So I have decided to teach him one final unforgettable lesson. I have been working with Mr. Davies for months. He has all the details. Trust him. He has my final blueprint. And Carol, my love, never forget how strong you are. You are my partner in building everything we have. You have more steel in you than our son gives you credit for. Use it. I read the letter 3 times, the words a balm to my wounded heart and a fire in my veins. Frank had seen it all. He hadn't been blind. He had been planning. The next day, I sat in Mr. Davies's stately wood-paneled office. The place smelled of old books and quiet power. He was a kind man with sharp eyes that had seen everything. "Carol, I'm so sorry for your loss," he began, his voice gentle. "Frank was more than a client. He was a friend." "Thank you, Mr. Davies," I said, my voice steady. "I found a letter. He said you had his final blueprint." A slow, knowing smile spread across Mr. Davies's face. "Ah yes, the blueprint. Frank was a brilliant man, always 3 steps ahead. He loved his son, but he despised entitlement." He slid a thick, blue-backed legal document across the polished desk. "This is the will that Frank allowed Kevin to see drafts of during their succession planning meetings. It would have made Kevin the primary heir to Thompson Construction and the bulk of the estate." My heart sank a little. "So, he changed his mind at the last minute?" "Not at all," Mr. Davies said, his eyes twinkling. He then reached into his briefcase and pulled out another identical-looking document. "This is the actual last will and testament of Franklin Thompson, signed and witnessed 6 weeks ago. The other one was a decoy." My jaw nearly hit the floor. A decoy. Frank knew Kevin and Tiffany would be snooping. He wanted them to feel secure, confident, even arrogant. He wanted to give them enough rope to hang themselves with. I finished, a shiver running down my spine. "Precisely," Mr. Davies confirmed. "In this will, the Real will, Frank leaves his entire $55 million estate, the business, the properties, everything to you." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. "But, Kevin." "To Kevin," Mr. Davies said, his expression turning solemn. "He leaves exactly $1, and a letter explaining why. But that's not all. Frank was meticulous. He knew they might contest the will, claiming he wasn't of sound mind. So, he underwent a full psychological evaluation a week before signing. It's ironclad. Furthermore," he paused, pulling out a small digital recorder. "He started recording some of their family dinners and business meetings after his diagnosis. He has Kevin on tape talking about when I'm in charge and dismissing your role in the company as just a housewife's hobby. Frank hadn't just left me his money. He had left me an arsenal." Armed with the knowledge of Frank's brilliant, devastating plan, I walked out of Mr. Davies's office a different woman. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was play my part. For the next week, I had to become the woman Kevin and Tiffany already believed me to be. A helpless, grieving widow, overwhelmed by the complexities of a world she had never had to navigate alone. The call came 2 days later, just as I knew it would. "Mom," Kevin said, his voice oozing a syrupy, fake concern. "How are you holding up? Tiffany and I were thinking we should come over. Help you start sorting through some of Dad's papers. You shouldn't have to face that all by yourself." "Oh, Kevin," I said, letting my voice tremble just a little. "That would be so helpful. I'm looking at his office right now and it's too much." "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. We'll handle it," he said, the satisfaction in his voice barely concealed. They arrived that afternoon, striding into my home as if they already owned it. Tiffany was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. She gave me a hug that felt like being held by a cold statue. "Oh, Carol, you poor thing. We're here now." I led them to Frank's study. I had spent the morning preparing the scene, scattering some files on the desk, leaving a tax folder open, placing a box of tissues prominently on the corner. It was a masterpiece of manufactured helplessness. They took the bait immediately. Kevin sat down in Frank's leather chair, his chair, and started leafing through the papers with an air of authority. Tiffany perched on the edge of the desk, her sharp eyes scanning everything. "Wow, this is even more complicated than I thought," Kevin said, shaking his head. "Good thing we're here, Mom. You would have been totally lost." "I know," I whispered, looking down at my hands. "Frank handled everything." Tiffany's eyes landed on a small velvet-lined box on the corner of the desk. It held Frank's vintage Rolex, the one he wore on their wedding day. It was my most treasured memento of him. "Oh, Carol," she cooed, picking it up. The gold gleamed in her perfectly manicured fingers. "This is beautiful. A man's watch. You should really let me hold on to this for you. For safekeeping. In all this chaos, something so valuable could easily get lost or misplaced. We'll keep it safe for the estate." The audacity of it took my breath away. She wasn't just after the money. She was picking the bones clean, taking the one thing that was purely sentimental, purely mine. I could feel a hot flash of rage crawl up my neck, but I pushed it down. I looked at her, my eyes welling up with fake tears. "You're right, Tiffany," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It is so valuable. I wouldn't want anything to happen to it. Please, you keep it safe for me." She snapped the box shut with a triumphant little click, a flicker of a smile crossing her lips before she replaced it with a look of solemn responsibility. She shot Kevin a quick, victorious glance over my head. They thought they were so clever. They thought they were managing a fragile old woman. They had no idea they were dealing with a predator. I let them take the last physical piece I had of my husband, the watch that had ticked off the minutes of our life together. I let them walk out of my house with it, feeling smug and powerful, because I knew with every fiber of my being that the price they were about to pay for their greed would be far, far more valuable than a piece of gold. The week leading up to the will reading was a masterclass in hubris. With Frank's Rolex secured and my apparent helplessness confirmed, Kevin and Tiffany moved from planning to action. They were no longer just talking about their future empire. They were actively building it on a foundation of sand. Kevin, convinced he was just days away from a massive inheritance, decided he couldn't wait for the bank's slow, tedious loan approval processes. He was a Thompson after all. He needed to move at the speed of opportunity. I learned about it through Mr. Davies, whose network in the Austin financial community was extensive and discreet. Kevin had sought out a man named Mr. Silas. He wasn't a banker. He was a private lender, a loan shark who wore expensive suits and operated in the gray areas of finance. He specialized in bridge loans for impatient heirs and desperate businessmen, at interest rates that would make your blood run cold. Kevin, swaggering with unearned confidence, apparently walked into Mr. Silas's office and laid out his situation. He presented himself as the sole heir to the Thompson construction fortune, a $55 million estate that was just temporarily tied up in probate. He needed a short-term loan, just $2 million, to secure a few time-sensitive deals before the formalities of the inheritance were complete. Mr. Silas, no doubt smelling an easy mark, was happy to oblige. He drew up a contract on the spot. $2 million for 30 days with the Thompson estate as collateral. The interest rate was astronomical, and the penalty for defaulting was severe. Kevin signed it without a second thought. To him it was just a minor inconvenience, a stepping stone. He was spending money he already considered his. With the $2 million in hand, Kevin went on a spree. He put a non-refundable $500,000 deposit on a sleek new commercial real estate development downtown. He invested another $1 million in a high-risk tech startup that a buddy told him was the next big thing. He was playing Monopoly with real money, and he thought he owned the whole board. Tiffany, meanwhile, was doing her part to spend their theoretical fortune. She traded in her perfectly nice luxury sedan for the latest model, a gleaming black beast that cost a fortune. She hired a high-end interior designer and began a complete overhaul of their already expensive apartment, tearing down walls and ordering custom furniture from Italy. She was a constant presence in the city's most exclusive boutiques, her arms laden with shopping bags. She was dressing for the part of the city's new queen. They were so consumed by their fantasy, so blinded by their greed, that they never once stopped to consider the possibility that they were wrong. They saw my quiet grief not as genuine sorrow, but as weakness. They saw my deference to their business acumen as proof of my incompetence. Every time Kevin called to tell me about a brilliant new deal, I would play my part. "Oh, Kevin, that sounds so big. I'd say, my voice full of nervous admiration. Are you sure it's safe? Mom, you have to spend money to make money. He would lecture me, his tone patronizing. Dad was too conservative. I'm going to double his fortune in 5 years. You just need to trust me. I trusted him, all right. I trusted him to be exactly the greedy, arrogant fool Frank and I had raised him not to be. Every dollar he borrowed from that loan shark, every contract he signed, every dollar Tiffany spent on Italian marble for her new bathroom, was just another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. And I just stood back and watched them hammer away. The clock was ticking, and Mr. Silas was not a patient man. As the days ticked down toward the will reading, Tiffany's impatience began to curdle into something more sinister. She had the Rolex, she had a new car, her apartment was a construction zone of expensive upgrades, but she didn't have the real power yet. The estate was still technically in limbo. And she wanted it all now. It was her idea, I'm sure of it. Kevin never would have thought of something so cruel, so calculated on his own. The phone call came on a Tuesday, 3 days before the reading. It was Kevin. Mom, he said, his voice unusually bright. Guess what? An old friend of Dad's is in town, Dr. Miller. He's a psychiatrist. He heard about Dad and he'd love to stop by and pay his respects, just check in on you. My blood ran cold. I knew a lot of Frank's friends. I had never heard of a Dr. Miller. A psychiatrist? I asked, keeping my voice light. That's an interesting friend for your father to have. Yeah, well, Dad knew all sorts of people, Kevin said quickly, a little too quickly. He'll be in our neighborhood this afternoon. Is it okay if we just pop by for a few minutes? Against my better judgment, but knowing I had to see this through, I agreed. They arrived with him in tow. Dr. Miller was a man in his late 60s with silver hair, a very expensive suit, and a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He oozed a kind of clinical charm. Carol, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, he said, taking my hand. Frank spoke of you so often. He was a smooth liar. We made small talk for a few minutes on the sofa. Kevin and Tiffany sat on either side of me like bookends, watching me intently. Then Dr. Miller leaned forward, his smile becoming more therapeutic. Carol, he began, his voice soft and patronizing. Kevin tells me you've been having a difficult time since Frank's passing. That's completely understandable. Grief can be very disorienting. Do you sometimes find yourself forgetting things? Misplacing your keys, perhaps? And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a social call. This was an ambush. This was a paid professional, brought here to find cracks in my sanity. They were trying to build a case. They were trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. They wanted to get a conservatorship, to seize control of the inheritance before the will was even read. My first instinct was to scream, to throw them all out of my house. But then I remembered Frank's letter. Use the steel in you. So I took a deep breath, and I began the performance of my life. I let my eyes wander a bit, as if I was struggling to focus. Keys? Oh, I suppose so. Everyone misplaces things, don't they? Of course, he said smoothly. And the finances? All the paperwork Frank left behind. It must feel quite overwhelming for you, I imagine. I looked at him with wide, confused eyes. Oh, it is. So many numbers. I was just telling Kevin. I don't know what I'd do without him. I continued the charade. I forgot Dr. Miller's name midway through a sentence. I asked Tiffany if she thought Frank would be home for dinner soon, then caught myself with a little sad laugh. Oh, silly me. I keep forgetting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Tiffany shoot Kevin a triumphant little glance. They thought I was crumbling. They thought their plan was working perfectly. Dr. Miller nodded sagely, making mental notes. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine your own son, your own flesh and blood, sitting in your living room, trying to prove you're insane so he can get his hands on your money just a few days faster? At that moment, watching them, I knew that I would have no mercy. I would have no regrets about what was coming. They had just crossed a line from which there was no return. They had just sealed their own fate. The moment they walked out my front door, the fragile, confused old woman persona evaporated. I was shaking not from fear, but from a white-hot cleansing rage. I waited 5 minutes, watching from the window as their car disappeared down the street. Then I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Davies. They brought a psychiatrist to my house, I said, my voice low and tight. They're trying to have me declared incompetent. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Carol, are you all right? I'm more than all right, Mr. Davies, I said. I'm furious. His name is Dr. Miller. I will look into him immediately, he said, his voice all business now. Do not worry. They have severely overplayed their hand. And they had. By the next morning, Mr. Davies had a full report on my desk. Dr. Miller wasn't just some random psychiatrist. He had a history. He had been professionally reprimanded twice by the State Medical Board for unethical conduct, specifically for providing evaluations for hire in contentious inheritance and divorce cases. He was a hired gun, and now we had proof. This report, along with a sworn affidavit from me detailing the visit, went straight into the file. The file that was growing thicker by the day. Mr. Davies also confirmed, through his sources, the details of Kevin's loan from Mr. Silas. He had a copy of the contract. The $2 million, the exorbitant interest rate, the personal guarantee against an inheritance he would never receive. It was all there in black and white. For the last 2 days before the reading, I leaned into my role completely. I called Kevin in a panic, because I couldn't figure out how to pay the electric bill online. He had Tiffany walk me through it over the phone, their sighs of exasperation audible. See, Mom? This is what we mean. You need us. I even accidentally let them see a couple of credit card bills I'd left on the kitchen counter, marked past due. They weren't real, of course. Mr. Davies and I had them mocked up. But to Kevin and Tiffany, it was just more evidence that the old woman was losing her grip, that their intervention was not just justified but necessary. They were so busy patting themselves on the back for their brilliant, cruel plan that they never saw the real trap closing in around them. They saw a confused old lady. They didn't see the woman who was on the phone with Mr. Davies every night, meticulously documenting every condescending conversation, every lie, every move they made. The night before the will reading, I sat alone in Frank's study. I poured myself a small glass of his best whiskey. I held the glass up to the portrait of him that hung over the fireplace. Well, Frank, I whispered. Tomorrow's the day. I hope you're watching. Because the show is about to begin. Everything was in place. Every piece of evidence, every documented lie, every arrogant assumption. The stage was set. The audience was seated. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of their short-lived, self-proclaimed reign. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that when the truth was finally revealed, it wouldn't just be a lesson. It would be a complete and total annihilation. The conference room at Davies and Finch was designed to convey power and permanence. The mahogany table was so long it felt like we were in separate zip codes. The chairs were heavy leather that sighed when you sat down. On the wall, portraits of stern-faced men. The firm's founders looked down with disapproval. It was the perfect setting for a day of reckoning. As I described, Kevin and Tiffany were practically glowing with anticipation. They had dressed for a victory party. My simple black suit must have looked drab and funereal in comparison, which was exactly the point. Mr. Davies entered, his expression unreadable, and took his seat at the head of the table. He laid out the documents and the show began. He read the preamble, his voice a steady, unemotional drone. And then he delivered the first line about the disposition of assets. All of my estate, I give to my beloved wife, Carol Thompson. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It pressed in on us, sucking the air out of the room. I watched the blood drain from Tiffany's face, leaving her makeup standing out like a painted mask on a corpse. Kevin just stared, his mouth slightly agape, as if Mr. Davies had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Wait, Kevin finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse whisper. What? That can't be right. There must be another page. The business. Dad's legacy. Mr. Davies didn't even look up from the document. I haven't finished, Kevin. He continued reading, his voice cutting through the tension. To my son Kevin Thompson, for whom I had such high hopes and who has provided me with such profound disappointment, I leave the sum of $1. He paused, reached into his waistcoat pocket, and pulled out a crisp, new $1 bill. He slid it across the vast, polished table. It stopped directly in front of Kevin. It looked impossibly small and pathetic. $1. Tiffany shrieked, finding her voice. It was shrill, ugly. $1. This is a joke. He was sick. You old woman, you manipulated him. Before I could even respond, Mr. Davies held up a hand. I would choose your words very carefully, Mrs. Thompson. He then continued reading from the will, Frank's words now filling the room. I leave Kevin this $1 not out of spite, but as a symbol of the value he has placed on our family. He has shown me that he values an inheritance over integrity, entitlement over effort. He has treated his mother, my partner of 40 years, with a condescension that I can neither forgive nor reward. Kevin shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is insane. We'll fight this. We'll take this to court. My father was not in his right mind. Mr. Davies calmly removed his glasses and looked at my son. Kevin, I strongly advise against that. Frank anticipated this reaction. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, heavy folder. He dropped it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. What is that? Kevin asked, his voice trembling now. This, Mr. Davies said, tapping the folder, is what your father called his insurance policy. It contains a full psychiatric evaluation of your father, conducted 1 week before this will was signed, confirming he was of perfectly sound mind. It also contains. He paused for effect. Transcripts of several audio recordings. Conversations where you discuss your plans for the estate and your mother's incompetence. Kevin's face went ashen. Furthermore, Mr. Davies continued, his voice relentless, it contains a copy of a $2 million loan agreement you signed with a Mr. Silas, using an inheritance you would never receive as collateral. And finally, he pulled out one last document. It contains a report on a Dr. Miller and his recent unsolicited professional visit to your mother's home. Every word was a hammer blow. I watched Kevin sink back into his chair, utterly defeated. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the dawning horror of realization. He hadn't just been disinherited. He had been exposed. Completely and utterly. Tiffany was just staring at the folder, her mind clearly racing, trying to find an angle, an escape route, but there was none. Frank had sealed every exit. He had built the perfect trap, and they had walked right into it with their eyes wide open. The drive home from the lawyer's office was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the tires on the pavement. I felt calm. The storm had broken, and I was still standing. The anger had receded, leaving behind a profound, weary sadness for the son I had lost long before his father died. I had just walked in the door and poured myself a much-needed glass of iced tea when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime. It was a frantic, insistent jab. I knew who it was. I looked through the peephole. Kevin's face was pale and blotchy. Tiffany stood behind him, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of cold fury. I opened the door but stood in the doorway, blocking their entrance. "Mom, we need to talk," Kevin said immediately. His voice was raw, desperate. "This is a nightmare. You have to fix this." "There is nothing to fix, Kevin," I said, my voice even. "Your father's will was very clear." "But it's wrong," he pleaded. He wasn't thinking straight. You know, he wanted me to have the business, to carry on his legacy. That's when Tiffany pushed past him. "Oh, stop whining, Kevin," she snapped, her eyes boring into me. "She did this. Your mother. She poisoned his mind against you." She turned her full attention on me, her voice dripping with venom. "You have to understand," she said, the words a mockery of civility. "We have made commitments. Financial commitments. That restaurant franchise. The real estate deals. We can't meet them without access to the estate." "What kind of commitments?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I wanted to hear them say it. They exchanged a quick, panicked glance. "The restaurant franchise, it's $15 million, Kevin mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "The Miami property needs $2 million in funding next week," Tiffany added, her voice rising. "So, in total?" I pressed. "About $23 million, Kevin whispered, the number hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. "I see," I said softly. "And you plan to pay for all of this with your father's money. Money you hadn't even inherited yet." That's when Tiffany's carefully constructed facade shattered completely. "This is ridiculous," she screamed, her voice echoing in the quiet entryway. "You're going to let your own son be destroyed financially because of some vindictive game your dead husband decided to play from beyond the grave?" The words hit me like a slap. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she shrieked, taking a step closer. I could see the wildness in her eyes. "Frank is dead, Carol. Whatever petty grudge he had, it died with him. You're alive. You have the power to fix this, and you're choosing to hide behind the will of a corpse." Kevin went pale. "Tiffany, don't." "No, Kevin. Someone needs to say it. Your mother is a selfish, bitter old woman. She could transfer the inheritance to you tomorrow, but she won't. She'd rather see you ruined." I looked at this woman, this creature of pure, unadulterated greed who had twisted my son into a reflection of herself. And then I looked at Kevin, who just stood there wringing his hands, too weak to defend his father's memory, too weak to defend me. "Get off my property," I said, my voice quiet but filled with the steel Frank had known I possessed. "Mom, please." Kevin started. "No," I cut him off. "She just called your father a corpse. She has stood here on his doorstep and screamed insults at me. And you have done nothing. You made your choice years ago, Kevin. You chose her. Now, you can live with the consequences of that choice." I started to close the door. "But the loan," he cried out, his desperation palpable. "Mr. Silas, the deadline is Monday. He'll ruin me." I paused, the door halfway closed, and looked at his terrified face. "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you signed a contract with a loan shark, based on money you didn't have." And with that I closed the door, turned the deadbolt and leaned against it, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear them arguing on the driveway, their angry, panicked voices fading as they finally drove away. The war was over. The fallout was just beginning. The collapse was faster and more brutal than I could have imagined. Kevin and Tiffany hadn't just built a house of cards. They had built it in the middle of a hurricane. The first tremor came on Monday. Mr. Silas, true to his reputation, did not wait. When Kevin failed to produce the $2 million plus the exorbitant interest, the consequences were immediate. Two large, intimidating men showed up at Kevin and Tiffany's apartment complex. They didn't come to talk. They hooked Tiffany's brand new luxury car to a tow truck and drove it away right in front of all their neighbors. According to my friend Margaret, who heard it from her hairdresser, Tiffany ran out screaming, threatening to call the police, but the men just laughed and handed her a notice of repossession. That was just the beginning. Mr. Silas wasn't interested in a car. He wanted his money. The threatening phone calls started, at all hours of the day and night. Then came the lawsuits. The developers of the Miami real estate project sued for breach of contract. The tech startup sued to recover their legal fees. The restaurant franchise went after him not just for the $15 million, but for millions more in damages and lost opportunity costs. The legal notices piled up like junk mail. The final professional blow came from the one place Kevin thought was safe, Thompson Construction. I had made a specific choice not to fire him. I wanted him to quit or be fired for his own actions. It didn't take long. His work performance cratered. He was constantly on the phone with lawyers and creditors. He was distracted, irritable, and made several costly mistakes on a major project. But the last straw, the HR director later told me, was when he tried to use the company's line of credit to secure a personal loan. He was fired for cause the next day, escorted out of the building he thought he would one day own. Their social standing evaporated overnight. News of the disinheritance and the mountain of debt spread like wildfire through the Austin social scene. They were no longer the golden couple, the city's next power players. They were a cautionary tale, a piece of juicy gossip. Their country club membership was revoked for non-payment. Invitations to parties and charity events stopped coming. Through it all, I remained silent. I didn't answer Kevin's frantic, pleading calls. I didn't intervene. This was his lesson to learn, and I would not be his safety net. The breaking point, the final, inevitable implosion, came from within their own marriage. Tiffany had not signed up for this. She had married an heir, a future millionaire. She had not married a disgraced, unemployed man drowning in debt to a loan shark. She saw the writing on the wall. Mr. Davies informed me that she had filed for divorce. Her petition was a work of art in its own right. She claimed she was a victim, that Kevin had defrauded her, misrepresenting his financial standing and future prospects from the very beginning. She was trying to sever herself from his debts, to escape the sinking ship with whatever jewels and designer clothes she could carry. She abandoned him in the middle of the wreckage he had created, taking what little was left and disappearing from his life as quickly as she had entered it. In the span of a few short weeks, Kevin had lost his expected inheritance, his job, his car, his reputation, and his wife. He was left with nothing but a $1 bill and a $23 million mountain of debt. The empire of greed had crumbled into dust. He had hit rock bottom, and he was utterly, completely alone. For 6 months I heard nothing. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. I learned through Mr. Davies that the bankruptcy was official. The court had liquidated what few assets Kevin had, which barely made a dent in the mountain of debt he owed. He was legally shielded from the big corporations, but the personal debt to Mr. Silas was another matter entirely. That kind of debt doesn't just disappear. I worried, of course. A part of me, the mother in me, lay awake at night picturing the worst. But another part, the part that honored Frank's final wish, knew that this process, however brutal, was necessary. Then one day a letter arrived. It was a simple plain white envelope, addressed to me in handwriting I barely recognized. It was from Kevin. My hands trembled as I opened it. I was expecting a plea for money, another desperate demand for me to fix his life. But it wasn't that at all. "Mom," it began, "I don't have any right to write to you. And I'm not writing to ask for anything. I need to say I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I treated you. For the things I said. For disrespecting Dad's memory. For being so blinded by greed that I became someone I don't even recognize." He wrote that he was working. He'd lost his apartment and was living in a small, run-down room he rented by the week. He was doing manual labor for a landscaping company, mowing lawns and digging trenches in the hot Texas sun. The work was backbreaking, he wrote, but it was honest. "For the first time in years," the letter continued, "I know what it's like to be truly tired at the end of the day. To earn a paycheck, no matter how small, with my own 2 hands. I think about what Dad always used to say, that hard work builds character. I never understood what he meant until now. He didn't mention Tiffany. He didn't blame anyone but himself. He ended the letter by saying he knew he didn't deserve my forgiveness, but he hoped that one day he could become a man his father wouldn't be ashamed of." I didn't reply. It was too soon. One letter wasn't enough. But the letters kept coming every month or two. They were a chronicle of his slow, painful climb from the bottom. He wrote about selling his last few possessions to make a small payment to Mr. Silas, not because he had to, but because he needed to. He wrote about the simple pride of being able to afford his own groceries. He wrote about the friendships he was forming with his coworkers, men who judged him on his work ethic, not his last name. The real change became apparent about a year later. A friend from college who owned a small construction company in Denver had offered him a job. A real job, starting at the very bottom as a laborer on a building site. Kevin had moved. He had left Austin, left the ghosts of his old life behind. His letters from Denver were different. They were filled not with despair, but with a quiet sense of purpose. He wrote about learning to frame a wall, to pour a foundation. He talked about the satisfaction of seeing a building rise from the ground because of his own effort. He was rediscovering the very industry his father had built an empire on, but from the ground up, with dirt under his fingernails. He was no longer the entitled prince waiting for his kingdom. He was just a man working, learning, and slowly, painstakingly rebuilding not his fortune but his character. He had lost everything he thought he wanted, and in the process he was beginning to find the one thing he truly needed, himself. 3 years passed. 3 years in which I finally learned to live for myself. I sold the big house in Austin, the place that held so many memories, both good and painful. I bought a beautiful, light-filled condominium overlooking the ocean in California. I traveled. I took classes. I reconnected with old friends. I built a life that was quiet, peaceful, and entirely my own. Kevin's letters continued to arrive, marking the passage of time and his own quiet transformation. I learned he had been promoted from laborer to foreman, then, a year later, to project manager. He wasn't just working in construction, he was excelling at it. His company specialized in building affordable housing developments, creating homes for families who needed them most. He wrote about it with a passion I hadn't heard in his voice since he was a boy talking about baseball. "Mom," one letter read, "I stood on a site today and watched a family get the keys to their first home. The look on their kids' faces. It was worth more than any stock portfolio. Dad built luxury hotels. I'm building communities. I think he would have been proud of that." He had also, over 3 long years, paid back every single dime he owed to Mr. Silas, plus the interest. He had worked extra shifts, lived frugally, and sent every spare dollar to settle the debt. The bankruptcy had legally cleared him, but he had chosen to clear his own conscience. Then last month the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar Denver number. "Hello," I answered. "Mom." The voice was deeper, calmer than I remembered. It was Kevin. My heart did a little flip. It was the first time we had spoken in 3 years. "Kevin," I said, my voice quiet. I hope it's okay that I'm calling," he said, a little hesitant. "I just wanted to share some news. I've been invited to speak at the National Housing Conference in Chicago next month. They want me to talk about the projects we've been doing here." He paused. "Mom, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I'm going to be in Chicago. Would you be willing to see me? Just for a coffee?" The question hung in the air. The final test. I flew to Chicago. We met in a small, quiet coffee shop near his hotel. The man who walked in was not the boy I remembered. He was leaner, his face weathered by the Denver sun. His hands were calloused, but his eyes were clear. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from accomplishment, not entitlement. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his work, about the families he was helping. He told me about the lessons he had learned about money, respect, and integrity. He never once mentioned Tiffany or the inheritance. He apologized again, properly looking me straight in the eye. "I failed you, Mom," he said. "And I failed Dad. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to honor the man he tried to raise." As we were about to leave, he reached into his wallet. He pulled out a worn, folded $1 bill. He placed it on the table between us. "I've kept this with me every day for 3 years," he said, "to remind me of the price of greed, and to remind me what's actually valuable." I looked at my son, truly saw him for the first time in a decade. The entitled stranger was gone. In his place was a man, a good man, a man Frank would have been proud of. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Keep it," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "to remind you of how far you've come. Thank you for listening to my story. It was a long and painful journey, but it taught me that sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go, and allowing the people you care about to face the consequences of their own choices. It's the only way they can truly find their way back." Have you ever had to make a choice like that, a choice that hurt in the moment but was right in the long run? I'd love to read about your experiences in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories from the heart.